Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and DEI experts. Each episode, I ask our guests one key question, and let's be real, a bunch of follow-up questions, highlighting their area of expertise in DEI. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator and advocate working for the DEI and e-learning consultancy Dialectic in lovely Guelph, Ontario. Welcome back to all of our listeners. I hope you had a fantastic summer. And I am thrilled to be jumping back in because on this week's episode, I am joined by Dr. Joel Davis Brown, and I'm just very excited to introduce you all to his work. Dr. Joel Davis Brown is a sought-after public speaker, a poet, an entrepreneur, a self-identified nerd specializing in organizational strategy and culture, transformational leadership, global inclusion, executive coaching, conflict resolution, and strategic storytelling. He is the Chief Visionary Officer of Numos LLC, a management consulting and coaching firm based in San Francisco and in Nairobi. And he's also the co-founder of the Global Inclusion Praxis Model, as well as the Global Inclusion Certification Program, a global institute designed to train practitioners on how to facilitate equity work anywhere around the world. He is an adjunct professor at the IESEG School of Management in Paris and Lille, France, where he teaches storytelling for leaders and story listening. And additionally, and most importantly for our conversation today, he is the author of the groundbreaking book, The Souls of Queer Folk: How Understanding LGBTQ plus Cultural Values Can Transform Your Leadership Practice, which, I can wholeheartedly recommend, having read it myself. So hello, Dr. Davis Brown. It is great to have you on the show.
Hello, and feel free to call me Joel. You scared me a bit in the intro because you said to the audience, I hope you had a great summer. I'm like, oh no, summer is over. Can we
To be
hold on to
fair,
it for a little bit longer?
yeah, this will be airing in September when the leaves will have turned and
Yeah,
everybody's taken a little bit of break from the podcast, and now we're coming back for the fall. So absolutely, it is winding down, unfortunately. But I hope, we'll squeeze what we can out of the last couple of weeks for sure.
sure. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The question that we're going to explore together today is obviously very much related to your latest book. And it is, how can queer values transform leadership practices? So I don't want to drown this in context. I'd love to just jump right in, and maybe we can start by you telling us about why you wrote this book and what the work means to you.
Thank you. And again, thank you to your audience for listening and for being with us virtually. I wrote the book out of sheer curiosity. There was no grand plan. There was no scheme. I really wanted to understand from a ethnographic standpoint, what does it mean to be gay or queer or LGBTQ? Because those answers have been elusive. And in many situations, I had heard people talk about what it meant to be Black or what it meant to be a woman and how those values translate into leadership. But the question of what it means to be LGBTQ is something that has not, frankly, really been studied directly. And I found a lot of literature, if you even want to call it that, that was, it was kind of fluff. There were some stereotypical ideas and notions thrown out there, but there was never any credible study that squarely asked this question, which I think happens, or that was the situation for a number of reasons. Number one, because I don't think a number of people have thought to actually ask, what does the LGBTQ community represent, because of their own disdain, their own stereotypical notions. I also think for a number of people, this idea had already been solved. And so when you talk about what does it mean to be a member of the community, people could just reduce it to, oh, you're attracted to someone of the same sex. You are focused on sex and sexuality. You're gender nonconforming, so you use different pronouns. You are transgender, but there's so much more. And I'm not here to suggest that those things are inconsequential. They, of course, are very important and I think really influence how our world operates. But there's so much more there. So I began the study during my doctoral program to ask that question of what does it mean? And this is something I've been thinking about since I was a little kid. Once I started to uncover what some of those values were, I started to also realize that a lot of the adaptive qualities and the leadership qualities that queer people have are what we as a society need, particularly at this stage in the game. And what I mean by the
Mm,
game is, we're dealing with some pretty significant issues: climate
absolutely.
change,
Yeah.
polarization, just to name a few.
Hmm.
We just came through COVID. I just heard this morning that the pandemic or the virus is rebounding. There's another variant.
Yeah.
So, how do we as a society learn to navigate these challenges? And when I think about the queer community, one of the things that's been front and center for me is here's a community, and I'm a part of the community, that has dealt with constant changes, threats, and challenges to its existence.
Mm,
And yet the community has been able to thrive. The community has been able to do very miraculous things, not just in terms of its presence and its energy, but in terms of impacting the world. So then to me, it became pretty, um, I don't know, obvious. This is a community that we need to study, because if
mm,
this community has been able to survive, given all the things that are happening to it, and particularly given a lot of the backlash that we're seeing against the community, not only in the United States, in Italy, in parts of Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also in South America as well, but in all parts of the world,
hmm.
and this community has been able to do well, then there's something in its cultural DNA that I believe the rest of the world should study in order to be better leaders. And so that's how we
Absolutely.
got to this place with this book. And so initially, my question or the inquiry was just going to be about what does this community stand for and help people to be better allies. So it's going to be a kind of a cultural attaché. It now has the additional layer and the preeminent layer of being a leadership book and guide for people who, no matter what your walk of life is, no matter where you are, who you are, how can you be better as a person, as a human being, as a global citizen, and then as a professional? So
Mm,
that's what led me to write this book.
amazing. And I'd love to get into that piece about the leadership implications of some of the things that you
Sure.
found a little further on. But first, I'd love to just unpack this a little bit, the idea of queer culture. So, I mean, like you said, we know kind of intuitively that there's a difference between queer and mainstream culture. Sometimes it's a difference that is so thick that you can feel it walking into a room or into a conversation, or, if you're me, into a backyard barbecue with a bunch of very straight people.
Mm-hmm.
But you went beyond just this intuition in your book. And like you said, beyond the stereotypes, beyond sort of our existing mainstream understanding of what makes somebody queer or gay or LGBTQ.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you defined it so thoroughly. So, can you tell me a little bit about your approach to sort of identifying the components of queer
Mm-hmm.
culture and the approach that you took, and then maybe a few of those key components?
Sure. So you're asking me to get nerdy, and I love to be nerdy. So when I thought about the research question was, what does it mean to be LGBTQ? And the first thing I had to think about is, who am I going to speak to? So I wanted to speak to people who were familiar with the culture, who had a positive relationship with the culture, and were invested in the community. Like they were, working steadily in some capacity to navigate, or they were consistently navigating the community on a daily basis, not just going home, going to work and identifying as LGBTQ, but they were
Mm-hmm.
people who talk to others regularly. And so who were those people? So I identified leaders. Now, these weren't people who carried a certain position or title or had money or influence. Because sometimes when we think about leaders, we're going to get into that, I hope, later. That's how we tend to identify leadership is you have to have some level of prestige. But for me, it's
Mm-hmm.
more about your level of commitment, your level of engagement, and it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. So we had people that we interviewed in the Bay Area, which is one of the places where I live, who were involved in a number of different community initiatives, whether it's around healthcare, whether it was around spiritual growth. Some of the people were involved in artistic initiatives and organizations. Some were athletically inclined and involved in sports. It ran the gamut. And what I loved about the study is that 60% of the people who we interviewed were people of color. We had a number of people who were transgender. I don't have the figures in front of me, but we had a
Mm-hmm.
very diverse sample. And in talking to them, we asked them questions, for example, of, what does it mean to be queer? What are the values that became more important to you as you became more comfortable with your queer identity? What are the things that you focus on and gravitate towards more once you came out? What are the things that
Mm-hmm.
you see being celebrated and espoused within the community? So we did that. Now, of course, we know that the Bay Area and Northern California is not representative of the world. So we took statements for each of these values, and there were 15 values that we identified where people said, this is fundamental to who I am as a queer person. Everything from a sense of community, a sense of justice and equity, nonconformity, uh, gender fluidity. I would say also things such as discernment, just being able to read the room and have that kind of situational or environmental awareness. So we took those things and then we applied it to a broader group. So we took our questions and created a survey, a kind of quantitative instrument. And we said, let's see how people across North America feel about this. So we found people on social media and the internet, not my favorite place to be. And there were about 600 people. And for each of the values, more than half of the people who were interviewed said these are values that definitely, in their mind, describe what it means to be LGBTQ.
Mm.
And so that gave us the kind of the validation, if you will, to say these are things that have resonance. Now, when people hear these values, sometimes what they'll think is, so are you saying that everybody within the community subscribes to these values? Not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they do subscribe to those values, it doesn't mean they subscribe to them in the same way. So, for
Right.
example, the idea of community for me is let's have a dinner party and have people together because I love to break bread and share food and music and art with people together. For others, it might be something completely different.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The key thing to take away from it, though, is although there's going to be variation, because of course we are a very diverse community, the values themselves, the core values, the essence of who we are was consistent. And, when we talked to the larger group across North America, we also had quite a bit of variation in terms of, and diversity in terms of age and religion and socioeconomic status and gender identity and nationality and immigrant status, et cetera, et cetera. So from a statistical standpoint, we had a really nice, diverse sample that I think speaks well of the community and was something that was not just isolated to one type of enclave or one type of group. And so that's how we came to the conclusions that we did, that these things are
Mm.
important. And honestly, I wasn't surprised by what I found out. Intuitively, I had a sense that, yeah, we as a community have, I think, a healthier, more open relationship in terms of talking about sexuality. I think we as a community very much are informed by creativity and the arts. We as a community value self-interrogation and looking deeply within ourselves to figure out who are we and to understand where we begin and end and where society begins and ends. And we value that type of analysis and self-inventory and review. So there were a number of different things, but it was nice, of
Mm-hmm.
course, to have data to back that up. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's how we got to that process. And that took place over roughly over a year and a half of doing research. And I would like to continue to do more research. That will be for a later time.
Of course. And I love that you've touched on this idea about some pushback around universality of the claims, like whether people are, nobody loves to be put in a cultural box or to
Sure.
say, well, I might not be, I have to be special. Everybody wants to be special. Nobody wants to be defined by like a series of 10 or whatever cultural values necessarily. But that's why I'm asking about the background and how you came to that, because it's not just assumption. It's not just based on personal experience. Your
Right.
book has so much personal storytelling in it. There's narrative woven through, but I loved that about your book, that it brought meaningful data into it. And I was kind of like really into the way that you collected the information, and the rigor of your approach was really apparent to me. And it made it, yeah, it really does stand up to that critique of the sort of the universality of cultural or values-based claims. Um, Now, of course, the book isn't primarily about sort of defending LGBTQ communities or extolling their virtues to sort of disarm the haters, although you do that really nicely throughout as well. But you, as you've mentioned, you had something else in mind. So can you tell me, why do you think leaders need the influence of queer culture? What is the leadership problem that you're trying to solve here?
The leadership dilemma that I see is, how do people become transformational? I'm an executive coach and I work with a number of leaders in a number of different capacities, and I work with them all across the world. And a leader to me is someone who's able to go into an environment, go into some type of ecosystem and to make things better. And to do so, you have to be able to transform the environment. I think where a number of people have misunderstood leadership is they think that it's an external component or that it's an external initiative. So therefore, I'm here to impact you. I'm here to make you feel more comfortable. I'm here to drive you to a certain level of performance, as opposed to recognizing that in order to impact other people, you also, and most importantly, first have to transform yourself. If you yourself are not transformed, then it's going to be difficult for you to transform other people because you have not done the necessary work. You will not have shown or have established the credibility. You have not built the relationship, and you have not modeled the behavior that I think is really important. That's what I would see. And I think leadership is not something, it's been amazing since I wrote this book because a lot of times I've had people, at least initially, who've said to me, well, even in some of the queer bookstores I visit, where they'll say, well, we've never had a leadership book, because they're thinking that it's corporate or they're thinking that this is for titans of industry. And I said, well, leadership exists in every domain. I said, the reason I'm here, for example, is because I saw great leadership in the home. That was my mom. Her birthday is today. I said, so if you're a parent, but more importantly, for you to be the best version of yourself, you have to be able to lead yourself. If you have a friendship circle, which a lot of us do, how do you show up in your friendship circle also is a component of leadership. How do you show up with your family? How do you show up with your neighborhood? And how do you show up with your community? So we exhibit leadership every single day before we walk into a workplace, before we punch a clock, before we sit down to type an email or to answer a phone or to work with a peer or a colleague or a stakeholder or a customer. So that's what I really want to focus on this, particularly, and the timing of this conversation is not lost to me, particularly as we see things such as what's happening in the United States, where you have a former president who's indicted, very bad form of leadership. We've seen it around the country, with the world. We've seen it in places like Eastern Europe. We're seeing, for example, a number of situations, both from the corporate space, but also from the political space, where leadership is failing. And I think we have to, at some point, go back to basics, but also realize that leadership also can be informed by people who are at the margins of society because they, I think, have the best vantage point to understand what's needed and what's not present. And I would say, in terms of the queer community, what we have embodied has allowed people to survive persecution. And when we say persecution, harassment, bias, death. If these qualities have helped us to survive and to still be here, then I would think anybody would want to be a better leader and could learn from our collective wisdom if you're trying to advance your career, if you're trying to do better or to manage a project more effectively. You can do that better, but you can also be a better human being and be a better person. So that, to me, is the reason why this is particularly rich. Also, as we see our community emerging and becoming more visible, I think the queer community is a community that is still undervalued and under-recognized, and we exist pretty much all around the globe. I can't speak for the far reaches of society, and where there might be some maybe insular communities where no one has identified as queer, or they don't have the language, or they're using different terminology, but we do exist everywhere. And so if we want to, in a multicultural society, figure out ways to be more relevant as leaders, we have to use different language and tools and recognize that the hierarchical, me first, individualistic model that has been portrayed and disseminated and highlighted is not working, not just for queer people, but for a lot of people. And we're seeing it borne out in the statistics where people say, I don't feel connected to my leadership. I don't feel connected to the workplace, and I don't feel safe. So we're seeing not only a moral imperative around how we treat our fellow human beings, but there also are financial implications because we're seeing businesses suffer, countries suffer in terms of lost GDP because people are not performing, showing up, and being their best selves because they feel like the model that's being used is just one that's not resonant for a majority of people, and it certainly wasn't resonant for me.
Oh, absolutely. I love that you've really connected this idea of leadership to personal things in the family, in the community, in the home, and that you see this connection so clearly between the values of queer culture and how we can all benefit. So I do want to ask you just to share a couple of examples. And I recognize that the cultural values that you have highlighted you work through them one by one in the book, and you talk about what that really means for leadership. And there's a lot of practical advice in there.
Mm-hmm.
But what is standing out to you as you've written this book and you're getting feedback from it? Is there a specific cultural value and its application to leadership that kind of comes back again and again as most impactful?
Yeah, I would say to you, the one that stands out to me, at least at the moment, is the value around justice,
Mm-hmm.
because we're kind of in a crucible right now. It seems like there's all these different movements, and there's more important, there's just a need for people to feel like, how can society be better to recognize the historical systems of oppression that have kept people divided and have kept people from achieving life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? So during 2020, and of course, even till now in 2023, we've seen a lot of people focus on, how can I be more involved? How can I be more active? How can I support people? And part of what has to happen with that, and part of what you see from the queer community, is the idea that in order for you to be active and in order for you to be an activist, you have to activate your consciousness. So what does that mean? That means, first of all, recognizing that you have an opportunity and you have power in order to affect and influence people around you. It is not something that's elusive. It's not something that is only owing to or held by certain people. You have to take some certain responsibility. I think it's the recognition that what happens to someone else also impacts you as well, and that we don't live in an island. And so, although our community has not been perfect in that respect, particularly when it comes to the trans community, or particularly to women and people of color, there is at least this recognition that we have to do more to support others whose pathway might be different than ours. But it also means taking some personal responsibility and recognizing that I have to change in my consciousness how I see things, and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that for me to live in this world, I have a responsibility and a duty to do things. And that the way that's going to show up is going to be different for
Mm-hmm.
everybody. Some people, it might be a letter writing campaign. For others, it might be taking to the streets. For others, it might be educating people in their sphere about the issues that they see in the world. But activation means that we take personal responsibility. It's not, again, an external orientation, it is an internal orientation. And this has been a hallmark of our community. And if you look at a number of the movements around, at least in the West and even beyond, but I can speak more confidently about what we've seen in the global West, all of them have been influenced at some level by the queer community. Whether we're talking about the womanist movement, the feminist movement in the US, the civil rights movement, those movements would not be what they were and what they are. Particularly if you look at a movement like Black Lives Matter, which was started by three queer women, we
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have those movements without the insight, the tenacity, the
Mm-hmm.
audacity. And I say
Mm-hmm.
that with admiration and affection of the queer community. And what that means is having a global awareness and a global mindedness to say, I can't just be content with what's happening in my little sphere. I have a responsibility to recognize what's happening outside of my individual circle, outside of
Mm-hmm.
my home, and outside of my particular neighborhood. So that's just one example of something that I think is really important, because
Yeah.
I've had people come to me and say, how do I get involved, and what is it that I need to do? And I say, well, recognize, why is this important for you in terms of doing this work, and realize that you, for example, fighting racial equity is not just about helping out, let's say, people of color. It is also about waking yourself up to the reality that when by allowing this system to maintain itself,
Mm-hmm.
you have also hurt and impaired and perhaps maimed a part of yourself. You have
Mm-hmm.
denied your own self a piece of liberation. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just about people of color, although people of color are the targets. It is also about you saying, I have got to be better, and I've got to liberate myself so that I don't continue to support, perpetrate, and maintain a system that would deny anybody their humanity. That's the key part of it, is that it's part of our individual liberation and the collective emancipation of people who might live around us.
Joel, I have goosebumps. I have goosebumps. That's so impactful. It's so impactful to think of leadership in this context, and to think, like, I think maybe it's just me, but probably not, is my guess. I digest so much leadership content that is so narrow-minded.
Mm,
And even things that call themselves transformational leadership, like, we
mm,
really do only stick to the corporate sphere often in our conceptions of leadership. We don't often delve into the personal. We don't often talk about liberation. And even in the DEI world, even within industries that are meant to challenge the structures, sometimes that critique can be muted, not absent, but sometimes muted. And so hearing you articulate that call for liberation that starts within and also challenges systems is really, really impactful to me. And I'm hoping it's impactful to our listeners as well. I'm wondering how that transforms, or how it applies rather, to the corporate sphere. So a lot of our listeners are coming at this podcast from within their workplace. They're thinking about their leadership, yes, in the home, yes, in the community, but also they run businesses. They are kind of corporate people. And so as a corporate actor, how can this be applied practically? How can I make a business whose goal is to liberate me and others, or at least to have that kind of cultural value worked into what I'm doing, especially under capitalism? Like, I just feel like there's so much tension there. And is it even possible to do one within the other? I would love to hear you comment about that.
Right. We live in a number of systems that, of course, are damaging to people and damaging to the planet. And when we think about how to dismantle them or how to contend with them, it can feel daunting, because how do we as a single person hope to brick by brick dismantle and to do away with things that are so very much ingrained in our society, such as capitalism and whatnot? What I would say to a number of listeners, and this is something that a realization I had to come to at some point in my career, early in my career, is that it always depends on the level of work that you do, always depends on the level of system and where you're operating. And so, what do I mean by that? When we go into our workspaces, we're not necessarily asking people per se to be responsible for bringing down capitalism or patriarchy by themselves, or to take on that responsibility, because of course that's an awesome responsibility, and a system in it by its very nature is something that has to be dissected and broken apart collectively. We have to have our institutions working at that level. We have to have our laws and our social mores change, and we also have to have individual action as well. Here's what I was saying in terms of the corporate sector, realizing that a lot of this work is not just based on a history lesson. So this is where I've seen a number of organizations, a number of leaders struggle. I've had people who, for example, around, let's say, Me Too, they're going to seminars, they're going to trainings and workshops, they're going to museums, they're learning more, they're reading more, and they say, okay, I've got all this information, what do I do? And I say to them, the opportunity is not just to have a history lesson or a lesson in sociology. The opportunity is to recognize how within the system that you operate, so within the business or the organization, how these different forces are being replicated and what can you do. So for example, if I'm working within a team, how might I, by my tone, my language, how I make decisions, how I mentor, who I choose to support and give assignments, who I choose to give praise to and give visibility to, how I communicate, how I give feedback, how am I replicating the system? And within that level of analysis, what can I do so that another person can come in and feel affirmed, or at the very least not be as harmed as they would be naturally, because we're working within a capitalistic system. So if you're talking to someone and you're giving them feedback, are you doing so in a way that is designed to build them up, that is designed to be clear, is affirmative, is fair-minded, or are you doing it in a way that's destructive? And we know that for a number of marginalized communities, we might not get feedback at all until a decision is being made about job promotion or job advancement, or perhaps termination of a particular job that we have. In terms of our decision making, do we take time to give people all the information that we can? And sometimes that's not possible, but do we also take time to inform people why that's not possible, and to inform them of all the different alternatives that are there? Do we make them feel like they're equal partners at the table, or do we simply have kind of the lone wolf perspective to say, I've made this decision and I'm going to hand this down like stone tablets and you have to take it for what it is? Do we take time to affirm people? So that old model of you come into work and you just keep your head down, you grind, you work from 9 to 5, 8 to 4, what have you, but then you go home. Do we make space for people to be human? Do we recognize that people are not just machines? We're not robots. We give people space for recovery. Do we take time to champion people and to recognize that who they are culturally is just as important and supports the work that they do, their cultural insight, their sensibilities? How do we do that? So if you are, and I, of course, I don't want to make it seem like I don't work with corporations. I work with corporations all the time. But if you are someone who works within a business or an enterprise and you say, well, how do I make this real? You make it real by making sure that the people around you, the customers, your
Mm.
clients, your colleagues, and the people who report to you feel the effect of your change in consciousness so that they don't feel like they have to sacrifice themselves or the business. You make sure, are you showing up in a way where they feel like they can be heard? Are you championing them in terms of who they are, not who you will purport or want them to be, but are you recognizing their gifts and talents based on who they are? Are you
Mm.
giving them chances to be their best selves? Are you taking feedback? Do you allow their ideas to be part of the design process? There are all sorts of things that you can do to make sure that, again, the system that we work within does not become as explicit and as replicated within the microcosm known as our a workplace or
Hmm.
a business as it would be otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's where I think I would love to see people do more work because you see a lot of organizations, a lot of them progressive, who will sign on to any type of social movement. They're donating to this campaign. They have splashy things on the website. But then you go inside the organization and people are miserable.
Mm.
People don't feel seen. People don't feel respected. They feel like they're being condescended to. And that has really, to me, been the eye opener. I don't worry so much, to be honest with you, about conservative organizations because I think sometimes when I talk to conservative organizations or organizations that are green in their DEIB approach, they know they haven't done well. They know they can do
Mm.
better. They know there's opportunities to be better. It's when I talk to the progressive organizations and many of them who think, hey, we got it. We understand this. We've been doing this for a while. And you talk to people. And I remember working with, we were releasing conversations with a company in New Jersey, and we were going to do some anti-racist training. And the way that they spoke to me, the way they spoke to my colleagues, and I had to say to them, this in and of itself is a microcosm and a representative of how you're treating people within your organization. If you cannot speak to me with respect, if you're cutting me off, if
Mm.
you're approaching me with a level of hostility, if you show no grace in your dealings with me, I can only imagine what you're doing to the people who are inside of your organization. So that's how it shows up. And I know for some people, they might say, well, that's small beans. It's a starting point. And it doesn't mean that's the only way or the only front on which you can initiate this change, because there might be things that you can do civically. There are things that you can do politically. There are things that you can do socially. But if
Mm.
you're doing those things, but you come to work and you're still yelling at, your direct reports, if you're still referring to women as girls, if you have people of color in levels of position and influence, but you don't listen to them, which we hear all the time,
Yeah.
then you have really missed the point. And so that's
Yeah.
where the work has to be applied.
I love this idea of just finding those little pockets of influence within that larger structure that you might be embedded in. And again, this like idea of self-transformation and then bringing that into everywhere that you happen to be. I think it's very powerful and it is intuitive to a point, but I think people do miss this a lot, right? It's like work becomes separate. Work is its own environment and we don't necessarily connect the dots. Like we don't even necessarily see the link between running a business or a corporation and impacting social change. Like making that connection can be really tricky for people who do have influence. I've been in a position like that where I'm encouraging people who have tons of power to affect things outside of their company and to make those broader connections with civil and political actors and to kind of wield their power for the things that they claim to believe in. So there are things I think outside of companies, but there are definitely opportunities in those little pockets inside too. And you've raised a whole bunch of examples of where to get started, and so I appreciate that very much.
Absolutely.
Um, so I want to ask you sort of as a almost a last question here, but for leaders out there, I guess for anybody who has any kind of leadership application, as we've learned, who are considering this concept for the very first time,
Mhm.
can you share some high level advice for how to become more queer minded? Like, could you
Ah,
demystify this a little bit? Because I think, we're typically taught you're queer or you're not. And rather than, queer values are for everybody. So,
right.
how should people, especially cis straight people, respectfully engage with queerness and the values of queerness?
I think if you really want to take this to heart, I think the first thing is just become familiar with the community. And understand, number one, the history, the sensibilities, recognize that no one person speaks for the community, and recognize that this is going to be a lifelong orientation. No book, no article, no magazine, no study, no research is going to give you the information and the insight and the wisdom that you can gain from by talking to people and learning more about their journey, and recognize that there has to be a level of cultural humility. And
Mm.
so, no matter what you think you know, no matter what shows you've watched, what friends you've entertained, what social media or pop culture influencers you follow, there's still always something more to learn because our community, I always say, we're one community, but we're many peoples, plural, right?
Mm.
So I think starting there, I think number two, taking some time to really understand what some of the gifts are and recognizing that being queer minded does not mean that you have to be queer. We're not encouraging people to culturally misappropriate or to, misalign themselves or to identify in ways that don't feel natural and right for them. But every community possesses something that you can learn from. And so the opportunity is how can you do that? But we want to make sure that people do this in a way that's respectful and doesn't feel like they're being transactional. And I think,
Mm.
again, what I would encourage a number of people to do is examine their starting point with respect to the community. What do you know about the community? What's your relationship with the community? What are some biases that you might have with the community? And that's even for those of us who are within the community, because again, just because I am LGBTQ, what is my level of familiarity and comfort with the trans community or with the bi community? What are my preconceived notions around gay men, et cetera, et cetera? So examine your biases, examine your stereotypes, be open to learning and to unlearning what you've already have learned. Look for numerous examples of how queer people show up, because what I highlight in the book is just one lens and one view, but there are many different ways you can do it. And then find ways that you can incorporate these values in ways that fit your personal sensibilities. So we're not
Mm.
asking people, for example, to be Joel Davis Brown or to be any number of other people. We're asking you to use what we value and what we honor in a way that fits who you are as an individual. And that's how you become queer minded. If we were to tell people or to suggest that they had to become mini me's or they had to become clones or
Mm.
replicas of people within the community, that's antithetical to the idea of being queer. Queer means
Mhm.
that you challenge the existing norm, that there is no set standard, that you can be whoever you want to be. And so queerness, by its very definition, means how can you be your best self and also honor your own individual sensibility in order to impact the world.
Mhm.
So that's what I would say to people. So just as a recap, to learn and spend time with the community, to recognize that there are many different viewpoints within the community, and recognize that there's a plethora of ideas and sensibilities, and to indulge that, but not to think that one view is going to be the only expression of the culture. Understand your starting point, understand where you perhaps maybe need to let go of some biases or preconceived notions, study these values and honor these values, and figure out how you can fit them into your own individual sensibilities and continue to do the work.
Mm.
No matter
Mhm.
how much you may think, I got it, I'm an ally, I'm a supporter, there's always something to learn. And I know, as someone who hopes and likes to consider myself as an ally of many different movements and many different communities, I always have to challenge myself to say, how can I be better? How can I learn more? And when I think I've learned a lot or I think I've learned enough, that's when I know I need to learn more and
Mhm.
continue to embrace. And I would say, too, queer minded means being the best version of yourself and being unapologetic about it. And so as you go through this, it can be scary. It can bring up all sorts of fears. But I would say to you, if you have people who can put their lives online every single day
Mm.
in order just to exist, then hopefully that will be inspiration for people to challenge the way they think and the way they lead in a way so that they can create a more positive impact for those who are around them.
Yeah,
So that's my hope, and
absolutely.
that's my recommendation.
Well, very well articulated. I don't know how to add to what you've said. Like, I just feel like that's such a beautiful encapsulation. And the thing that strikes me is just that, like, queer values kind of beget queer values. Like, if you have enough openness to start down that path of learning and accepting difference and, getting rid of sort of your binary thinking and opening some of those pathways, like, those are the things, like the values of queerness, that will lead you to then be more open to more of those conversations and so on. So it's just sort of like, I just think of it as this self-propelling process. But I also really appreciate your invitation to dive deeper for people who are within the community as well.
Yeah.
And, knowing that it's peoples within a broader community is an important reminder that, just if you have queerness in your own identity, that doesn't mean that you know everything there is to know about everybody who's in that shared community. So I really appreciate that little call out. You've shared so many great first steps for people. This has been a really rich conversation. And as we wrap, I want to invite our listeners to pick up this gem of a book. Like it's really unlike any leadership book that I've read. And it is a beautiful mix of storytelling and research findings, and obviously very practical leadership advice. And of course, if anybody's curious about Dr. Davis Brown's work, make sure to keep up with him on LinkedIn, and you will find the link to his profile along with a link to his book in the show notes. Joel, I have one last bonus question for you as we close. Sure. Is there any other person or organization whose work you'd like to amplify?
I would love to amplify the work of Rainbow Railroad. They're a nonprofit. I don't even know if that's the right terminology in Canada, but they are a social justice organization that helps LGBTQ plus refugees. Sitting in the States, and even that is kind of an ironic statement given what's happening in the States these days. Sitting in the West, it can be easy to forget that there are a number of people around the world who don't have the honor, the privilege, and the space and the freedom to have this conversation, to read this book, to talk about these philosophical things. They're just trying to survive. Rainbow Road does the critical work of supporting LGBTQ plus refugees and helping them to get to places where they can be safe. The road of a refugee is a treacherous one, because not only do you have to worry about escaping persecution, leaving behind your family and everything that you know, but also moving to a new country, a new place where you're isolated, you're alienated, and you may still feel alone. And so any work that we can do to support those who are less fortunate, wherever they might come from, I think it deserves our support. And Rainbow Road is a leading organization that's doing that really critical and undervalued work. So I would really ask people to donate to support them. There's also the LGBTQ Asylum Project in the United States. Both of them are near and dear to my heart. And so I'd ask people to research them, learn more about them, spread the news, and support them if they can.
Fantastic. And we will drop links to both of those organizations as well in the show notes, so our listeners can be free to check that out and to contribute in any way that they can. Dr. Joel Davis Brown, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And to all your listeners, and particularly to all the queer people who are listening to this, thank you. This book would not be possible without the collective energy, support, prayer, and essence of the community. And this book almost didn't get written because I had a publisher that told me this was nonsense. That's another book at some point that I'll write. So I just want to say to people, continue to fight, continue to take care of yourself. But more importantly, let's continue to take care of each other. That is, to me, the hallmark of great leadership. So thank you. And thank you.
Yeah, of course. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today. And as always, I want to welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on the podcast yourself, or if you'd like to sneakily nominate someone. You can find my email in the show notes as well. And just a reminder, if you like what you're hearing, leave us a rating and a review, or share this episode to your own socials. It really does help get the podcast, and in this case, Dr. Joel Davis Brown's message into more ears. So it's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. I'm Dominique. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Just One Q.